You've just written this really interesting book, Accidental Conflict, America, China, and the Clash of False Narratives. And before we dive into this, why don't you just tell us, who are you? And where did you come into the China equation? And how, since you did enter into this whole question, what's your glide path been?
Who am I? That's a great question, Orville. Whoops, that could be me.
We both are challenged here with our...
This is who I am. It goes back, I think, to the glorious days of Morgan Stanley, where I spent 30 years largely as their chief economist. But halfway through my career, I decided to take on a global role, and lo and behold, we stumbled into this Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. And I had a terrific team of economists working for me, but they were clueless on what this crisis meant for Asia, let alone the world. I had a hunch, and I have operated on the basis of a lot of hunches over the years, that China, a place I had been to a few times in the late 90s, but not a lot, would hold the key to the end game of that crisis. So I started going there, New York based at the time, and in late 97, early 98, I was going once every other month. I quickly got hooked on the place, started writing about it. I had a Chinese economist working for me who was extremely helpful in translating, ushering me around. But I wrote a piece, I think, in, I want to say it was in the spring of '98, published in the Financial Times, basically arguing that China would, in fact, come out of the Asian financial crisis as the new leader of the Pan-Asian economy, and the former leader, Japan, would be dead money for the foreseeable future. My new friends in China were embarrassed by it. My old friends in Japan didn't speak to me for about 10 years. And
did they think you were too optimistic?
About Japan? China was sort of a reluctant, I think, reluctant to accept their role as being, a new source of strength, both in Asia and globally in the late 90s. They quickly got over that reluctance.
That was keep your head down and bide your time.
Hide and bide.
Yeah.
As sort of these things happen, a copy of that article got in the hands of the then finance minister of China, Xiaoping, and he was coming to the U.S. on an official trip, and on the way back was stopping at Boeing, where he was about to become the representative of Boeing's largest foreign purchaser of aircraft, and wanted to know or his team wanted to know if I wanted to fly to Seattle and meet him. I did. We hit it off, and the rest, as they say in Hollywood, is history. He opened a lot of doors for me to the senior leadership. I got invited to a number of pretty high-level meetings and conferences in China, and I established a reputation as the Wall Street outsider who understood China.
Did you feel you really understood it?
No, I didn't. I really didn't. But I traveled around. I had great curiosity. I met a lot of people. I did, have the opportunity of meeting, a number of the, I would say, second-generation reformers both academics and policymakers. And I was brought into the inner circle to some extent. The guy who really made it for me was the former Premier Zhu Rongji, who set up in the year 2000 a small gathering called the China Development Forum, which was designed to expose the ministers of the State Council right after the National People's Congress to pretty intense debate and scrutiny with international academics and outsiders. And I didn't go to the first meeting, but I went to the second meeting. I've been every year since then. It's been on hold for 3 years because of COVID. And I am going back again next month for, I think, the 22nd year in a row. That meeting, like the second or third time I went there, I got involved in a big debate with somebody over the state of the global economy, and Zhu Rongji was very interested in the debate, and in our sort of final session with the premier, he asked us to replay the debate, and we did, and he became a big supporter of mine as a result of that. So, it's just a series of events like that. You just in the right place at the right time with some instincts and hunches, and the experience has changed my life. That's for sure.
But those were kind of glory days, weren't they? When China was getting into the World Trade Organization, Bill Clinton was getting the most favored nation status. So, it seems to me back in the late 90s, even maybe the early 2000s, a certain sense of optimism that things were headed in a direction that was favorable for all parties was justified. Now, describe what happened in terms of how you began to look at China since that time.
Well, I did become a student of a lot of what was written about what we now refer to, perhaps fondly, some of us, is the Deng Xiaoping model, which was as we saw it from the West, a model that was taking China, admittedly a blended economy, toward increasingly market-based characteristics. And the turning point for me in that first part of my journey was in March of 2007, after the conclusion of the National People's Congress. The then premier, Wen Jiabao, who
actually was running the economy, unlike the present prime minister.
Well, the subsequent prime ministers have been pretty well neutered, but he was in charge of the economy, and he made this really rather shocking statement at his press conference in March of 2007 that China looks strong on the surface, but beneath the surface, it is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable.
Did you agree with that?
And I did, and it really, I think the important thing about that statement was it sparked a huge internal debate as to how to modify the Deng Xiaoping model. And the solution that came out of that is, past performance is no guarantee of where we're headed in the future. We got to do something big, and the big thing they decided to do was to shift the economic growth framework away from exports and investment increasingly toward one driven by internal private consumption. And that energized me. I just said, look, this is a flexible system. They understand what's missing, and they're moving to put in place a new approach, and I doubled down on my optimism and stayed that way for a long time.
And then what?
And these last few years have been rough. I hate to personalize it, but since the leadership of Xi Jinping in November of 2012, the pendulum has swung the other way. So whether it was the consumer-led rebalancing, which didn't get quite the traction under Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao as it should have, the pendulum was swinging the other way. State-owned enterprise reform, which is always an important missing piece of the Chinese growth equation, I think stalled out. And the new approach, what I thought was really problematic. It was sort of what they call a mixed ownership SOE reform that was more Japanese-like than market-oriented, where SOEs started buying shares in one another, which, as we saw in the Japanese Carrezzos, was a recipe for disaster.
And meanwhile, you had these huge private companies growing up alongside and competing.
I think that's, that was part of the problem. The SOEs not only were stalling out in terms of the reform, but their returns and productivity were lagging that of the private sector. And by doubling down and shifting the pendulum of power back to the low productivity SOE sector, Xi Jinping, I think, created some very, very serious headwinds for the economy.
So as this was all happening, what's going on inside your head? I mean, what are you thinking in terms, as you went stage by stage?
I'm thinking, at first, having read about his father's role, first being persecuted in the Cultural Revolution, then being what's the word I'm looking for? Rejuvenated. No, it's not.
Rehabilitated.
Rehabilitated.
Yeah, that's very specific.
Yeah, rehabilitated. Yeah, rejuvenation comes in later.
All forgiven.
Yeah, but rehabilitated, and then playing a key role in driving reforms in Guangdong province. I figured the son was cut from the same cloth, and I was pretty optimistic that Xi Jinping would pick up the mantle of the reforms that had not been implemented under Hu Jintao. And for a year or so, it looked encouraging, and my friends inside of China, which I now had a lot of, smart, dynamic, a lot younger than me, said, yeah, this is going to happen. You just wait when you see the reforms that are going to be enacted under the so-called third plenum of late 2013. And sure enough, the party under Xi proposed these sort of very comprehensive set of reforms, and I continued to be encouraged that this was going to be the catalytic spark to completing the emergence of a powerful, dynamic, more balanced, sustainable machine. And then slowly but surely, the juice ebbed out of that impetus for reforms. An anti-corruption campaign became a campaign focused on political power consolidation. And by 2017, we started seeing the movement back toward a much deeper Marxist ideological commitment that conveniently became known as Xi Jinping thought. Initially, I would have to say I was in denial over the significance of that, as were a lot of my Chinese friends inside of China, saying, it's just party speak, don't take it seriously. And in retrospect, we should have taken it more seriously, and now it's really has a strong grip on what had been a dynamic economy, and in many respects a more dynamic society. And then a couple of other things happened along the way just to sort of complete my own conversion. The demographic problems, which we all knew were coming because of the one-child policy, have come much sooner than expected, consistent with China that always does things more quickly than we're accustomed to in the West. But the working age population has been declining since 2015. And so the economy says we understand what that means. When your working age population declines and you want to keep growing, the only option you have as a policymaker is to boost the productivity of the declining workforce. Makes a lot of sense, and yet the productivity was going the other way because of the the shift in focus back to low productivity SOE reforms.
Or allow immigration, which China has never been very.
And they don't like Japanese. They're not big fans of bringing in foreign labor. And then I guess the final shoe fell for me in the summer of 2021, when they unleashed these really draconian restraints on the internet platform companies and the activities that drive this new digital dynamic economy in areas like in music and gaming and video streaming, and they crushed the private tutoring sector, and suddenly the animal spirits that create so much incentive in this country and in countries like China were being crushed.
And why do you think Xi Jinping, where do you think that impulse came for him, and what made him think this was something that needed to be effected to the greater glory of China?
Well, there's the clever answer is one person did it, Jack Ma. And was it a coincidence that Jack Ma, who always was very bold and sometimes a little bit too forthcoming in speaking his mind, but also I would say getting to know Jack a little bit over the years, courageous in holding to a lot of strong views about society and the role of business in society.
But not being a bomb thrower. He wasn't an active anti-party agent.
Not at all. He built, the most powerful internet platform company in the history of China, and some might say even in the history of the world, bigger in some respects than our own, e-commerce giants in the United States. But he gave a speech in front of a conference who in the audience sat a number of very senior Chinese regulators who were appalled by what he said about the integrity of or lack of integrity in the Chinese financial system.
I think he called it a pawn shop, if I recollect correctly.
I think he did. And, the same thing has been said about other financial systems, including the one where I'm very grateful for having spent 30 years in my career. But, was it a coincidence that literally within days of that the public offering of his fintech subsidiary of Alibaba, Ant Financial, was pulled back, canceled, and then began, a series of examinations and rectification of one company after another.
So how do you analyze now, looking back on it? I mean, he was sort of the first high visibility entrepreneur with a so-called private company that came a cropper. But when you look back on it, what do you think was going on?
I think these private companies, especially the internet platform companies, personified a threat to the centralized ideological control that had become Xi Jinping's image, his goal in China. The ideology did not allow for this sort of cowboy entrepreneurialism, and the culture that these internet companies was fostering amongst young people in China. I think he viewed this as a threat to his control, to the party's control of the system.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Ma was almost like a head of state, wasn't he? Going around the world talking with heads of state, heads of companies. And so do you think that the incipient power that these private companies, which were very large and successful, was what spooked the party and thought it was time to yank their chain?
I think that's too simple, but I think that's, there's some truth to that. I really do. I think they had pushed too hard against the increasingly strident ideological control of the system that Xi espoused. And then they sort of claimed that in retrospect, well, we'd been planning to do this all along, and it looks like we're responding to one situation, the Ant Financial IPO, but actually these are plans that had been underway for some time. I find that hard to believe.
Yeah. We could go on, I think, for the rest of the session talking about the evolution of the Chinese economy and where it's headed, and maybe we'll come back to it. But in your book, sort of the heart of your book is the supposition that each member of this Sino-US relationship has gotten the narrative about the other somehow wrong, which abridges the ability for us to establish any modicum of trust and thus do anything more than end up in a vortex downward, which we clearly are at this point. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you is to describe, just sort of briefly, what you think the two narratives are. And also, I'd like to get you talking a little about, trust is the heart of diplomacy and the heart of being able to do things with someone else. But I want you to kind of give us your assessment of how trustworthy you think the Chinese Communist Party is as a diplomatic partner.
And then you're going to ask me because I'm a relationship guy, so I always have to look at the other side of the coin.
Yes, I know.
And then the follow-up question is you're going to ask me how trustworthy is today's Republican Party.
Or even the Democrat. I mean, how trustworthy is our system is a fair question. But sketch us out so people understand what it is you're writing about.
Let me do one thing first. Why did I focus on false narratives? I mean, what is it about nations, whether they're the United States or China, that the false narrative becomes such an important part in framing our perceptions of other nations? Mm-hmm. And the simple answer is that the false narrative is an outgrowth of nations that are surprisingly vulnerable themselves and don't want to face up to that. And they'd rather blame somebody else for that vulnerability than take on the heavy lifting of addressing that vulnerability. So 2 examples. One, the U.S., and this is where I started writing the book, was about America's false narratives of China. The U.S. blames China for its trade deficit. If it wasn't for China, we wouldn't have a trade deficit. Ironically, of course, we said the same thing 30 years ago about Japan, also the largest piece of our gigantic trade deficit in the 1980s. But the way I, as an economist, look at trade deficits is that they don't occur in a vacuum. They occur because nations don't save. And when they don't save and they want to grow, they import surplus savings from abroad, run these big balance of payments trade deficits and multilateral trade deficits with many, many countries. Last year, the U.S. ran trade deficits with 106 countries. China was the largest, but by higher math, Orville, that leaves 105 other countries. So she must agree. So, you know, the false narrative is to blame China for a trade deficit that we ourselves are responsible for because we don't save. And the major source of our dissaving is these massive budget deficits, which are still a growing problem in the United States. But I decided, you know, that if that's all I was going to write about, you know, the book would not be credible. And I had to look carefully at many of China's false narratives in the U.S. And the one I'll just give you an example of is one of my favorites, and we've already talked about some of it, is the fact that China has not completed the structural rebalancing of its economy. And they blame America's policies of containment for that failed structural rebalancing. America certainly does have, I think now, we've come pretty clean in our desire to contain China. But China's failed rebalancing has nothing to do with that. It is sort of an own goal because they have not completed many of their reforms that would stimulate consumption, like building a robust, well-funded social safety net for retirement and health care. China's false narrative is to blame their adversary for their own shortcomings in dealing with many of their structural issues. So 2 vulnerable nations actually have something in common, and that is blaming each other for their vulnerabilities. And it goes on and on. I mean, I take these false narratives into the realm of technology and censorship on the part of China, information distortion on the part of the United States, and then I just let the facts fall. In the last 5 years, we've gone from a trade war to a tech war to now a new Cold War. Hello balloon, and this high-octane fuel of conflict escalation is very disturbing to me.
And yet, Steve, I have to say, if we look back to where you came into this, and I'm certainly a child of this period of engagement, there were 9 U.S. presidential administrations from Nixon on down, every single one of them bent over backwards to try to make engagement work. And you'll remember, just as one example of what happened after 1989, which is a terrible disaster, Bush sent Brent Scowcroft secretly to Beijing, a day or 2 afterwards, didn't even tell the American ambassador he was there. He met with Deng Xiaoping, and I recently got the transcript of this meeting. What was so extraordinary was it wasn't Deng Xiaoping begging Scowcroft not to lower the boom on China. It was Deng Xiaoping blaming the United States for causing the demonstrations, and Skolkoff saying, please, 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 President Bush is your friend. Don't cut things off. Let's keep things going. So I mention that only to say that we did have this long interregnum.
I wish I'd had that transcript when I was writing this book. Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
Second edition, boy.
So how did we get from this period where the Americans, I think, were quite, maybe they were looking through rose-tinted glasses, but we really thought we could get along. We wanted to get along. We were trying to get along. And then, yet, here we are, you writing this book about all these false narratives and us heading into potential hostility.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the blame has to come from a long, hard look in the mirror on our side as well. Mm-hmm. There is this view that has been formed about the WTO accession of late 2001. Clinton was certainly, Bill Clinton was an important part of the narrative of bring China into our Western rules-based system, and they will be more like us.
Yes, because we lost the Soviet Union as a common enemy, and we needed to recore our engagement policy with something new. And the something new was, let's just trade it and hug it out and have cultural exchanges, and we'll slowly converge, right? But that didn't work out as well.
I don't know about you. I mean, I have read the WTO accession protocols that China signed, and there was no promise in there that, we're going to be like you.
No.
There were some provisions in terms of reciprocity of government subsidies that pertain to state-owned enterprises that, you could maybe squeeze that type of conclusion out of in terms of operating in terms of a comparable market-based system. But not the thing that we missed is the fact that China was always its own system with its own values, and we didn't get that because we saw China through the lens that we see ourselves.
I think you're right, but was there not some time here? I'd be very curious, because I think I certainly believed that during this period of engagement, particularly before Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping started changing things, that they weren't going to become like us, but we were becoming more soluble together. And I thought this was a kind of a high point of American diplomacy to try to bend the metal, not break it.
Yeah.
And how did we end up where we are now then?
Yeah, it's a tough question, Orville. It's hard to really put your finger on one thing. I was pretty enthusiastic during that period for the reasons I've already described to you, and that is
I think a lot of people were.
The system that was reinventing itself,
Yeah.
because of Wen Jiabao's sort of paradox that he raised that needed to be addressed, and that China was responding to that in a way that...
So you drank the KoolAid a little too.
Yeah. I certainly would concede that. But I think, as the... during this last 10 years when the angst of the American middle class really rose to the surface and became the main event in our national political debates. Certainly, very much so with the election of our 45th president, Donald Trump, there was no turning back in terms of the animosity that has been directed toward China. And I'm not going to sit here and blame the conflict on Trump, because this has been building for years before that. But his rhetoric and the actions that he took and I have a whole chapter on that where I examine the so-called Section 301 allegations that were written up by his trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, in March of 2018, that became the foundational evidence of the tariffs that were launched. That personifies the case that then became accepted wisdom in America, that it's the unfair trading practices, the espionage, the forced technology transfer, the unfair treatments with respect to subsidies of state-owned enterprises, Chinese industrial policy. It took on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle now.
But was it not in some regards? I mean, Trump is a kind of a curious storm system all of his own. But the overall general downward decline in relationship, I wonder if you apportion, and this is difficult to do, blame on both sides. What kind of an equation do you come out with? I mean, that who sort of pulled the trigger, who really started it and then threw fuel on the fire? You cited Trump. And I went to China with Trump and watched the whole thing, him and Xi Jinping together. That was like an experience out of some strange dream. But
you were at that dinner in the Forbidden City?
Yeah. I didn't go to that dinner because they didn't let lowly people like me into the dinner. But, you know, it was really...
Well, you did go to the dinner at Mar-a-Lago. I saw a picture of you.
Of course, Zelig-like. But when you look back at, I mean, Trump is somehow special, but at the overall evolution, who do you think really triggered this thing and threw most of the fuel on the fire to get us into the train wreck we're in now? Because it seems like it's a pretty important question.
I don't want you to think. Well, you probably will, but it'll sound like I'm ducking the answer to your question.
No, please.
But let me give you my take on that.
Yeah.
In this country, we say America has a China problem. In China, the view is that China has an America problem. Mm-hmm. This book starts out, the first part of the book is about what I call the relationship problem, that we both have problems with each other. And, you know, I sort of make this audacious leap into relying on the pathology of human relationships and framing national relationships, where most of us know full well that when there are problems in a relationship, it's 99 times out of 100 the fault of both, not one. And so I really believe that, you know, in terms of assessing blame, I blame both nations probably equally for what is now a dysfunctional relationship with zero trust between them. You know, one of the chapters of the book really surprised me as I wrote it. It was called From Trump to Biden, the Plot Thickens. You know, talk about naivete. I truly believed that when Biden won, that he was going to try to put some of the genie back in the bottle. I mean, on day one of his presidency, January 20th, 2021, I think he signed 14 executive orders that reversed some of the most outrageous things that Trump had done. He stopped the construction of the border wall in Mexico. He ended the Muslim travel ban. He rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change, rejoined the World Health Organization. He had the perfect opportunity to say, we're taking these tariffs back to where they were before the trade war, and we're going to sit down and negotiate with China a tough agenda, but we're not going to negotiate on the basis of costly tariffs that are taking a toll on American businesses and consumers. He didn't do that. And when he didn't do that, the window slammed shut. The politics, the thin margin of support that Joe Biden had and still has in the U.S. Congress does not allow him to reverse course on an issue that resonates so deeply in the middle class. I didn't really complete the point I was trying to make earlier, and I think this middle class angst does not allow American politicians the opportunity to constructively engage in China right now.
And I think if there's one person who actually could engage in a way that would thaw out Xi Jinping, it is Joe Biden. So what you're suggesting is that internal politics here, as internal politics in China, makes it too costly for him to do that. Would you like to see him just call up Xi Jinping and say, listen, we are in a terrible impasse here. I fear what's going to happen. Let's you and I get together and slug it out and see if we can't find some off-ramps. Would you be in favor of something like that?
I would. I think it'd be a great idea.
Do you think do you think it's impossible for him to do it?
I think right now the odds of him doing it are number pretty close to zero.
Yeah. But isn't this what great leaders do?
Leadership, ultimately, successful leadership, is a true act of courage. So you've got to do something that is unpopular, goes against the grain, prepared to take your political heat, and recognize that, in the case of an American president, you're midway through a four-year term. It's obviously already focused on, his decision with respect to 2024, but he took a lot of risk this week in going to Kyiv.
Mostly physical, I think.
He knows how to. In other words, he knows how to pick his spots and take a risk. China is not a spot that he seems prepared to pick right now. But I think ultimately, as the conflict deepens, there will be a leadership decision point that a U.S. president will have to face, and will have to make some tough choices that will not be politically popular in his own or her own constituency in the United States.
I mean, remember, Trump went to see Kim Jong-un. Hardly a popular decision. I mean, not much came out of it, and Trump is not a very adept, I think, diplomat. But you do have to, in a certain sense, say that he stepped out of line to try to do something.
Well, isn't a better example Nixon goes to China?
Yes.
I mean, who would have ever thought? I grew up, in California, and certainly remember, his background as somebody who was stridently anti-communist in the early 1950s.
Yeah, rose to power that way.
And that was an important part of his ascendancy. And then the guy goes to China and changed everything. And
that's what he's remembered for.
Yes.
Not all of the other things he did, which are less edifying.
I think, he very complex man with a complex legacy, but that was a decisive and critical and strategically determined moment for the United States.
Now, before we get to questions from you all, let me ask you a final question, because it's so central to your book, and that is the notion of trust. That when trust vanishes, it's very hard for countries to come to terms with issues, particularly such as war. Do you think it is possible, as you've experienced China and as you come to know, at least from a distance, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, do you think they are trustworthy in a way that an American leader could find some receptor site to actually do something if they were bold enough and creative enough?
I end the book with 3 chapters on an agenda for sort of the relationship solution to the conflict that I describe in the preceding chapters of the book. And I don't pretend this is the
Well, they're very good ideas.
final answer, but I start out with moving from distrust to trust, and I recognize that we can't do anything until we reestablish trust, to your point. So I lay out an agenda, low-hanging fruit sort of midway in the tree, and then, really the big reaches. And I start out with a low-hanging fruit that can be picked easily. Reopen closed consulates in 2 countries. Relax stringent visa requirements. Restart popular and very successful foreign exchange programs. Somewhat higher in the tree, relax constraints on non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that have been tightened up dramatically in...
So let's say we had a leader that read your book and said, yes, I like this. I see a roadmap here. I'm going to try it. How do you think China would respond?
I think if we reopened the Chinese consulate that has been closed in Houston, they would reciprocate. There's a chance they would reciprocate and reopen the consulate in Chengdu. Mm-hmm. And what's the cost if they don't do it? We reopen a consulate in Houston. Big deal.
Yeah.
Or on visas. I'm actually right now trying to get my 10-year visa reinstated, which has been suspended during COVID. I think I've got it done. But I don't want to tell you the handstands and cartwheels I'm going through to get that done. It shouldn't. If the Chinese were to make it really easy, we would do the same thing. There's a good chance we'd do the same thing.
So you actually think that given the system that we now have become familiar with in China, and given our own political system, that the leadership was there, that we could actually break through some of these boundaries and
little things are important, and I think the small steps, when you put them together, become big steps. I mean, the other 2 pieces of my plan, one is to reestablish or restart negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty to open markets to each other, which are pro-growth as opposed to doing things like focusing on bilateral trade deficits, which for reasons I tried to explain earlier won't work. But the third piece is one that actually I'm proudest of, that has the least likelihood of being endorsed in the U.S., and that's establishing a full-time organization that I call a U.S.-China Secretariat that brings together professionals from both countries operating on a full-time 24/7 basis, dealing with all aspects of the relationship, from trade and economics to innovation, technology, state-owned enterprise, subsidies, even these big issues like climate, health, cyber, and even human rights. That comes with a dispute resolution mechanism, the ability to convene experts to troubleshoot difficult problems like COVID. By working together and in a collaborative spirit, again, we take small steps in rebuilding trust. There's great potential to collaborate at the professional high level in both nations. I've built, over the 25 years I've been engaged in China, extraordinary relationships with the Chinese, and I know you have too. That collaborative work can percolate up.
Yes, I mean it's a long process to sort of restore the musculature between the two countries that could actually deal with some of these problems. I just and here I may disagree a little with you. That's why I've been pressing you on it. To what degree you think China might respond in an open and reciprocal manner to some of these these suggestions that you have? Because it seems very often they don't. We can't even get a hotline, a mill-to-mill dialogue going.
Yeah, that was the problem with the balloon.
Yeah, and they don't pick up the phone, and what are you going to do?
We hurt their feelings. I mean, look, I don't know, Orville.
I'm not very big on safe spaces, Steve,
yeah,
I have to say.
I get that. But look, I've had the opportunity to present this sort of plan of conflict resolution on sort of both sides of the Pacific. I have not yet been able to do that inside of China. As I said, I'm going there next month, and I'm going to do it.
Well, Godspeed.
But I was in Hong Kong last month, which, as you know, is now a large Chinese city, and I was pleasantly surprised by the response that I got when I presented my three-point plan to a number of different audiences in Hong Kong.
Well, God knows we need some solution here because we are in a vortex that seems to be taking us.
But on the other hand, I have made the presentation to comparable groups in the U.S., and then the collective response is, you got to be kidding me. No way.
But what if Xi Jinping proposed something, said to Biden, listen, call him and said, listen, we got to do something. We can't just let this thing slide down the mountainside. And said, let's start with this, this, and this. What do you think the response would be?
I don't know. I'd have to. I mean, there's a part of me that wants to say, Joe, come on.
Yeah.
He's giving you an olive branch. You're a practical guy. Think about it. And then there's the sort of the political baggage that the presidency is always encumbered with when he starts troubleshooting this proposal amongst his staff, and they always, raise other questions about collateral issues that say, well, if we give on this, what about that? And
this is, of course, where leadership has to override ambiguity, isn't it? And get something done. Otherwise, you'll just never go anywhere. Well, listen, I mean, you and I could talk for a long time, but we have a whole audience out here. Pardon?
We have time for a few questions.
Let's take a few questions. I cannot see you all, but pass the microphone and just quickly identify yourself and quickly ask a question, and we'll get Steve to respond.
Ken Wasserman, I'm an attorney. Can you offer some of your thoughts on how to balance the lower productivity of SOEs with the lower inequality that they help to bring to the Chinese people?
Well, they do have this campaign called Common Prosperity, which is addressed to deal with the inequality of China. It goes back to Deng Xiaoping in the late 80s, when he also spoke of, while encouraging development, don't forget those who have been left behind. I think the English translation was, it's okay to get rich, and the second sentence was rarely translated in dealing with those who've been left behind. Xi Jinping is, this is important to his overall egalitarian instincts as a socialist leader. and yet, the proposal occurred at the same time when he clamped down from a regulatory point of view on the dynamic internet platform companies. So that was a 1-2 blow for the wealth creation ambitions that underpinned a powerful drive of animal spirits in China. So, I don't know how far he's going to go and how successful he's going to be in dealing with inequality in this campaign. It's a noble objective. We have horrific inequality problems in this country, and I've tried to allude to the fact that that's played an important role in bringing China into focus as a lightning rod in dealing with some of the problems that have arisen at the lower end of our income distribution as well. I don't think this is going to be enough to offset, and answer your question, the productivity headwinds from ossified, inefficient state-owned enterprises.
Okay, next question.
Hi. Sorry.
Okay, one of you speak.
Hello?
How about here?
Yes, go.
Hi, this is Nixon. I work for Brunswick Group. I need to mention I was a journalist in China who looked to Orville Schell as a mentor and a leader for many years. Steve, thank you for your talk, and thank you for your realism and your optimism. On the question of Taiwan, obviously complex for many reasons. As an economist who understands politics, how do you see the role of semiconductor production tempering or exacerbating the situation around Taiwan?
I think it lurks in the background of any serious discussion of China's intentions in Taiwan. China obviously is lagging in having a domestic capability in chips that is comparable to that of Taiwan. Some think that is a strong enough motive in and of itself to accelerate reunification. I don't buy that. Contrary to the view in the United States, I do not subscribe to the notion that there's been a dramatic acceleration of the timetable that Xi Jinping or China has with respect to reunification. I know he's made some statements have been attributed to him that might suggest to the contrary, but I know full well, or I feel strongly, I should say, that that there's a real wariness of promoting an outright military invasion of the island and the cost that that would take with respect to not just military losses in China, but to China's place in the broader world. I worry, though, that about Taiwan, that we're up in the ante from our side, and we may force his hand, and so the conflict that maybe he doesn't want, he gets pressured into making an ill-advised move. But we've had one speaker go to Taiwan. We have another speaker about ready to go. The new House Select Committee on China bashing, their chairman just wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal today about his commitment to a strong and independent Taiwan. We've had a senior Pentagon official in Taipei recently. The U.S. Congress just passed a $10 billion Taiwan arms bill. I mean, we're up in the ante big time on our views that Taiwan personifies this struggle of autocracy versus democracy, and we're not, I think, fully taking on board the potential repercussions of forcing this issue, and I worry about that a lot.
My name is Wilson from Convergence Consultancy. Number one, if you can say a few words about the Uyghurs and human rights, that's a big issue. And number two, can the U.S. and China collaborate on fighting the climate crisis, even though there's a lot of backlash in the United States against ESG? Thank you.
Thoughts on the Uyghurs? And I mean, in your book, you cite climate change as one of the three obvious
Climate is
areas.
big. I prefer to talk about climate than Xinjiang. I'll let you talk about that. You know a lot more about it than me.
That's a third rail.
Yeah, that's truly the third rail. Not good. There's a terrific opportunity for us to collaborate on climate and alternative energy. And China obviously has an enormous environmental challenge of its own, one that, again, I haven't been there in 3 years, but one I have seen visible signs of improvement on in the last decade. And, you know, it's one key aspect of their challenge to improve the quality of economic growth that I think they've made progress on and will continue to do that. And shame on us if we don't work with them in our common goal of dealing with that. And I think that's the one area of these big issues where there's been a little bit of progress in the discussions that John Kerry has led from our side, but a good deal more needs to be done. And I agree with you on, you know, the Xinjiang problem. It's you know, it's a horrible problem, and China's unwillingness to really be transparent in addressing that is of deep concern to all of us. The best book I've read about it, from my point of view, is a book that came out, I think in September, Surveillance State, and one of the co-authors, Lisa Lin, was a former teaching assistant of mine at Yale, so I'm proud of her for doing incredible work on that. And it tells a really dystopian story of where technology can be used to suppress a population, a segment of the population, for whatever the motive is, with horrific consequences.
Thanks, Steve.
Orville, thank you. You're awesome.